Lila stands at the corner of 3rd and Clement, the bakery's bell chiming as if the town exhales. The street smells like warm bread and motor oil, a mix she has always called home. She presses her palm against the bookstore brick and feels lichen rough under her skin. Sunlight finds a tiny patch of her reflection in the glass. She left 2 years ago for a city job that promises a bigger life and delivers disappointments. She remembers the city lights like knives that sharpen everything, including defeat. She remembers nights sleeping on a friend's couch and mornings when the subway feels less like transport and more like a moving classroom of strangers. She learns a different grammar there, one that prizes speed and the glossy edge of novelty. Her inbox remembers sharper things, rejections, polite notes, and one line from an editor. Small towns don't build national voices. That sentence sticks like dust and finds its way under her skin. People here say softer versions of it, meant as caution. Lila keeps those sentences like coins rattling when she walks. She leaves the bakery with pastries and heads to her father's house. The door opens and Eduardo stands on the step with hands in his jeans. He carries the faint smell of motor oil and lemon polish. For as long as she remembers, he fixes things before they can declare themselves broken. He is shorter, shoulders curved from years at the hardware store. He studies Lila like someone checking if the pieces still fit. He says, "You took your time." Lila says, "I needed air." Her voice is smaller than she expects. Inside, Carmen sits at the kitchen table with bills spread like a fan and a cold coffee cup. Her hair is in a knot. She watches Lila with a practiced, sharp patience. Carmen's sentences are like nails, fast, functional, and exactly placed. Carmen says, "You're late to dinner and early to everything else." She asks, "Where did you park that big city again?" Lila laughs because it feels safer than explaining. They sit in the small domestic geometry of home, each claiming a corner of memory. The first week arrives as a string of small collisions, each one tender and sharp. Neighbors mention the factory closing, the school losing funding, the river full of plastic. People ask why she stayed, some with a boyish smirk and others with pity arranged like a casserole they offer politely. A PTA mother asks, "Are you back to help or back to hide?" Lila wants to say both but keeps her private reasons. Her mother's illness, a longing to breathe in reserve. On the 3rd morning, she meets Jonah by the river, where the water is always speaking under its skin. Jonah keeps a harbor of jokes and old river maps in his pockets. He wears salt and laughter like armor and keeps a hand on the raft. He looks at her with the easy interest of someone who has held the town's past like a soft thing. He says, "You look like you lost a bet coming back like this." He says it like a dare and an invitation. Lila says, "I lost a better bet." She tells him the city never touched her manuscript. He suggests she teach workshops at the community center and draws invisible circles with his fingers, as if the town could be rerouted with a gesture. At night, Lila sits on the porch with a notebook and a porch light buzzing. The dark hums with insect conversation and the occasional car's distant wail. Salt from the river rides the air like seasoning. She writes sentences that taste like river mud and sentences lifted from magazines. Criticism shadows the margins, and she folds the harsh lines into old letters in the drawer with her mother's recipes. Aunt Rosa calls about the Lyric Theater auction, and her voice carries the urgency of someone who knows what losing a place feels like. Rosa runs the cafe across the street and carries cardamom in her shirt sleeves. If Rosa is worried, then something important is at risk. She says they're auctioning the Lyric. They want lofts. The theater is where Lila learned to stand before a crowd. Silence there once taught her less than she feared. Carmen says we can't afford auctions. Bills lean like a dam against any larger idea. Lila thinks of stage wood worn like the palm of a hand and wants it preserved. She says, "What if we save it?" and sketches plans on napkins, voice part pleading and part stubborn blueprint. She draws seating diagrams with grease pencil lines and sums potential revenue in a messy column. The napkins look like the first drafts of a rescue. Jonah promises to haul chairs and paint signs. Carmen calls the idea romantic and impractical, but she remembers childhood plays that taught her a vocabulary beyond the hardware ledger. A comment thread in the local paper becomes a mirror where strangers throw stones and call it concern. Lila reads complaints, dreams don't pay bills, and notices how easy it is for words to feel like verdicts when she is tired. Eduardo says, You can try, Lila, but don't let these things hurt you. He speaks with the economy of someone who measures love in tools and meals. His caution is braided with trust, and she hears both. Jonah pins a handmade flyer to the community center board and arrives early with folding chairs and a thermos of coffee. People come with hopes and grudges folded into their pockets. Carmen sits beside Lila. At the mention of rehearsal space, her jaw loosens. An elderly man lays a box of old playbills on the table and says, "This place taught me courage." The paper is soft. Signatures smear where hands once trembled. Voices move between nostalgia and practicality. Someone insists the town needs a factory more than a theater. Another suggests the lyric could be a multi-purpose hall. Lila answers, "It can be both. Job fair in the morning, a play at night." She keeps sentences small so listeners can anchor them. A local reporter quotes her, "Culture is not a luxury, it's a lifeline." The line ricochets and becomes a talking point, a spear and a shield. The next day, anonymous comments bite, "You hunt applause here." Lila folds those words into a pocket and keeps them as fuel. Rehearsals begin and become muscle memory. The boards creak, lights smell faintly of old grease and time. Lila directs with palms that measure rhythm, clapping beats to steady the players. Actors forget lines and invent others. The mistakes stitch into the play like improvisation. Deep into those rehearsals, old stories surface. An actor named Ramon tells of the first time he saw his mother take the lyric stage at 19. He speaks with a voice like gravel polished by laughter, and the room leans in. "She was more frightened than she was brave," he says, "but the stage made her brave." The story matters because it turns a small domestic fear into something larger. People pass each other cups of coffee and learn one another's names properly. Lila spends an afternoon visiting the hospital wing where her mother received care. The smell of antiseptic hangs like a thin fog. She sits in a plastic chair and remembers hands that learn dialogue to soothe the painful quiet of chemo. Her mother once told her, "You don't have to prove anything. You just have to show up." At the time, Lila glazed those words with ambition, but now they return with years of clarity. The memory is not soft. It has edges that guide rather than punish. Mrs. Klein arrives at rehearsal and sits at the back. Lila feels the old admonition in her chest, the one Mrs. Klein spoke to her mother years ago about staying practical. Tonight, Mrs. Klein says, "I was wrong about some things." She offers a small private apology for an old cruelty, and nobody makes it public. The apology smooths a tiny wrinkle in the town's fabric. Carmen tells a story of her own, of 20 years at the hardware store, of nights balancing ledgers, and of the time the factory closed and they stood in unemployment lines. She keeps a ledger in her head and worries by habit. "I don't want us to be foolish," she says, "but I also don't want to live in a town that forgets how to make art." Her sentences are equations of care. Jonah shares a memory of his brother, who once took a small role and found new confidence afterward. Jonah's family had boats and seasons that took more than wood. He learned gentleness from that grief and hides edges with humor. A grant application returns with a refusal. For 2 days, Lila walks through town as if underwater, but refusal sharpens resolve. They hold a bake sale, then a yard concert where bands play for tips. People bring pies and tools and time. A retired electrician volunteers to teach basic lighting to teenagers, and suddenly the lyric's technical problems look surmountable. Not all work is public. Lila writes late and sends essays to city editors with steadier hands. She learns to write about the town without trying to reshape it into a city artifact. Some publishers decline, but drafts improve, and so does patience. She stores rejections as markers of a road traveled. The legal fight sharpens language into strategy. They interview lawyers and paralegals who teach the town to assemble a case. They catalog the lyrics' births, marriages, and funerals, list rehearsals and community meetings to show the theater as infrastructure. The developer's lawyer counters with property values and projected revenues. It is a contest of facts and interpretations. Lila sits through depositions and learns to answer questions without collapsing into the personal. At one point, she nearly unravels. A column calls the campaign sentimental and foolish. That night, Lila packs a duffel and debates leaving for the city. She imagines acceptance letters in the clean anonymity of subways. Jonah finds the duffel on her chair and says, "You can't run from yourself twice, Lila." His hands are warm on the bag. She considers his sentence like a mirror and decides slowly to stay. They rehearse testimonies and sit through mock cross-examinations. A retired English teacher helps Lila practice until sentences lay flat and true. She practices pausing to breathe and to look at faces rather than at papers. The practice steadies her. On hearing day, volunteers arrive with playbills and photographs. They present the theater's life like a quilt. The developer's lawyer reads projections and diagrams with precise cadence. Lila reads a letter from a woman who relearned to speak after a stroke in the theater's drama club. The judge watches faces, and the townspeople become the case. The temporary stay is granted, and the town breathes. The mural painting becomes ritual. Teenagers paint late into the night and write names in places a developer cannot scrub. The consortium purchase obligates programming and budgets that need constant tending. The legal wrangling continues. Audits and matching funds require work. But the muscle of habit, shopping for paint, calling volunteers, practicing lines, becomes the sustaining rhythm. A visiting troupe brings crowds for a 2-week run, and the lyric earns revenue while honoring purpose. Lila learns to frame criticism as data rather than verdict. She publishes essays that ask readers to reconsider locality. A teacher in the city writes to thank her for showing how a small theater can hold complicated life. The letter pins to the lyric office wall next to the email that once cut deep. Both teach her different lessons. Jonah and Lila grow closer through ordinary work. Eduardo brings home tools and labels a box for stage. Rosa expands the cafe, and the smell of cinnamon threads through Friday nights. The theater hosts job training days and refugee meetings and becomes both practical and theatrical. The lyric schedule is an anatomy of the town's needs and pleasures. Lila feels the work is messy but necessary in a way success press releases never are. Through these months, Lila learns that courage often arrives as small returns. She learns to measure success by neighbors who show up, by a teen's first public speech, or by the bakery lighting its window at dawn. These measures are humbler but truer. On a bright autumn day, the Lyric hosts a festival of short plays written by locals. A teenage playwright named Sarah reads a piece that makes the room ache with recognition. People stand in the lobby, suddenly a little younger, a little more open-mouthed with surprise. Lila watches and knows why she stayed. To be present when someone discovers themselves for the first time. After the festival, people linger under the marquee, talking about lines and laundromats and the stray ways a memory can become a scene. An editor from a regional magazine is there, notebook in hand, and he asks Lila to write a feature about rural arts. It is tempting in the way of a warm highway towards something larger. A week later, she receives a formal offer, a fellowship in the city with funding, and a stipend to write full-time. The letter arrives in an envelope that feels both like recognition and a test. Carmen folds it open with the same practical gestures she uses on invoices. Eduardo reads it and measures the margins with his thumbs. Jonah looks up from a stack of programs and says, "They want you to take the same route you tried before, but now they give you a gold watch." Lila carries the fellowship letter like a small planet for a few days. She imagines the speech she would give in a city hall, how she would tell the story of the lyric, and how it kept people together. But when she closes her eyes, she hears the bakery bell, and the river, and the porch light buzzing, and the sound settles differently. She thinks of the mother who taught her to show up. She thinks of a teenage girl rehearsing a scene with a voice straightening under stage lights. In the end, she writes a careful letter declining the fellowship, thanking the editors and explaining that her work is now here. She offers instead to mentor a student from the fellowship program and to send occasional pieces. The editors write back with surprise and respect. The decision feels less like refusal and more like a definition of where she will labor. Months later, an old critic publishes an essay praising the lyrics programming and naming Lila as a person who helped steady it. Mrs. Klein writes a small letter saying, "I didn't understand what we were losing. Thank you for staying." The letter sits in Lila's drawer beside the old editor's line and the teacher's note from the city, a small archive of the case against leaving and for remaining. A benefit for flood relief after a sudden spring storm turns the theater into a shelter and a donation center. People who argued months earlier stand in line to donate clothes, voices low and focused. Jonah plays a slow song, and Lila sits near the back, feeling the room as a living thing. When she walks home after the concert, Carmen and Eduardo have churros and coffee waiting on the porch. They sit and eat sugar like permission. The town hums and the lyrics marquee glows. Lila feels calm that is not the end of work, but the end of a particular fear. The choice to stay becomes practice, repeated. She rises to bills and rehearsals, to grant deadlines and teenage confidence that arrives in odd increments. Small acts of care accrete into a place that remembers itself. Years later, the lyric hosts weddings, meetings, refugee support groups, and a teenage playwright who sees her first work stage. Lila stands at the back of a packed house during a winter matinee and lets the lights warm her face. She thinks of the editor's sentence and lets it slide into the past like a turned page. Fragility remains. Budgets, tempers, and sometimes empty nights. But stubborn, iterative care keeps people returning. They practice being a town together. Lila keeps showing up because staying is not passive, it is constant work. Carmen says one afternoon, "You made the right choice." Lila answers, "We did it together." Eduardo nods and Rosa appears with churros to underline the moment. The win is small repeated decisions. Lila keeps criticisms in a drawer, reminders of what used to hurt. She tends people and the lyric and remakes a yardstick for success. The last light slides across the marquee and the town hums. Lila breathes in ordinary and extraordinary tangled and feels content in the particular calm of someone who chose a pilgrimage without leaving home. She walks toward a future built one cautious, brave step at a time.